Hello, everyone, and welcome into yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in today. Happy Halloween to all those who celebrate. Hope you have a happy, most importantly, safe Halloween night tonight. But if you are here to talk about fantasy sports, let's jump right into it because it should be a great show. We start off talking about some more general Week 9 prop bets. We previewed Thursday Night Football props yesterday, so I'm going to be focused on Sunday's slate of games as always. Then we look into the world of college football. Week 10 should be a good one. I'm going to give you a betting preview there. Then I'm going to be talking about some important injuries to monitor for Week 9 of your fantasy football season and what the potential fantasy implications could be in that regard. Then we're going to make my picks of the week and conclude with a Sunday Night Football betting preview between the Colts and my father's Minnesota Vikings. Shout out to my father if he is watching right now. But before we get into any of that good stuff and start the show, I do want to remind you that if you want to interact with the network exclusively, whether it be through short content or other podcasts around the network as well, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned. Great way to support. But if you want to support more directly, especially with my show or other shows live streaming, you can make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. You can do one of two things to interact with the show. You can either leave a burning question, comment, or concern throughout the show, and in any segment I will be able to read it out loud to my audience. But also, if you are so willing, you can press the $ in the comment section, leave a tip or donation as well. Anything you do is great. Interact with the network just makes this show and other shows around the network that much better. But without further ado, let us jump right into today's show here. Starting off, like I said, with a more generalistic view of Week 9 from a prop bets perspective. Now, all the prop bets that I've compiled really stem down to hype. Hype surrounding a certain player, hype surrounding a certain matchup, and most importantly, hype surrounding how you can approach the betting market week in, week out. Because there are so many different games and narratives to navigate when you are betting on games or players for that matter. And I really want to pinpoint. And Week 9's is probably the most diverse we're probably going to get all season with this prop bets list. I try to be as expansive as possible. I try to be as inclusive as possible. I try to be as diverse as possible. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with perhaps the most diverse pick I could have picked from any player, Jameis Winston, hitting the over in passing touchdowns. Who would have thought that I would be saying that phrase here in 2024 as Jameis Winston quarterbacks the Cleveland Browns after another Deshaun Watson season-ending injury. Now, the reason why Jameis Winston just looks so much more appealing from a betting perspective than anyone else in the Browns is because of his freewheeling spirit. We didn't get that with Deshaun Watson. We thought we were going to get the 2020 version of Deshaun Watson the instant he signed with the Browns. But to no avail, and now we are in the Jameis Winston era of the Cleveland Browns, hopefully seeing in him enough to hand the reins for potentially, after this season, a couple more seasons, should you know, in the draft, they feel like they could find a quarterback that they can develop. So it's going to be interesting to see how the contract situations play out here in Cleveland. But I think Jameis Winston, for the long run, is the best option the Browns have. Because, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, there's no really exception to getting out of this Deshaun Watson contract. You really put yourself into a corner if you're the Cleveland Browns, in that you have restricted the ability to either offload the contract on someone else or just cut him and try and save as much cap space as possible. Either situation right now is not tenable for the future of the Cleveland Browns. So for the time being, ride the hype train with Jameis. And he's playing a Chargers team that, yes, has been fairly decent up to this point in the season, but hasn't really experienced a quarterback who is willing to throw the football downfield as much as Jameis wants to. And so, with the playbook now wide open versus Stefanski in this offense, look for Jameis Winston to continue to take shots in the field, continue to play brave yet reckless football, and find ways to put points on the board. At plus 143, this is a bet that you should be willing to take just because of the freedom we now see in the Browns offense. So look for that to be a shocking, yet pretty intriguing prop bet to follow for this Sunday slate. Now going to a more chalk-like pick, so to speak, let's talk about Saquon Barkley. This is a guy who, when he's playing his best in this Eagles system, makes the Eagles one of the tougher teams to beat in the NFL. And check exactly who they're playing, but I do feel that each and every single time Saquon steps onto the field, he is going to put up points. They're playing the Jaguars. Now, yes, this could be seen as a matchups-oriented one, but let's be real here. In any situation, you would want a guy like Saquon Barkley in your parlay or general prop bets because of the fact that he's getting a lot of touches in the system and he's really helping this Eagles offense operate at a high level. So that's why I'm taking the over here at, I believe, 84.5 rush yards at minus 137. Look for him to truly continue making this Eagles offense a complicated one to crack. Because I can see how sometimes this offense can stagnate, but in games such as this, where the Eagles can be comfortable in how they run their offense, they're not going to be really tested at all. You're going to see the fruits of what Saquon Barkley can mean to this team. And not for nothing, they're going to have tough stretches this season. After this Jags game, they play 2 games in the division. They play one of the toughest NFC West teams in the Rams. They have the Ravens next, and they don't get much respite after as well, although they do conclude with 3 games in their division. So look for Saquon to have a strong reckoning in how this Eagles offense looks. And that's why I'm super hype about him from a betting perspective. Let's talk about the darker sides of the betting market in terms of certain players. Kind of a player who you're going to have to start selling. A player who, in real life, in fantasy, from a betting perspective, has looked unappealing ever since this whole Dolphins operation went off the rails. Let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Now, this Bills game certainly feels like one of those games where you could see the Bills letting their guard down and the Dolphins sticking around. But it certainly, now more than ever, feels too desperate of a situation for the Dolphins to really sway me in this one. Especially when it comes to Tyreek Hill. Because last week, yes, the hype around Tua coming back led them to a strong performance, perhaps one of their strongest performances since Tua's gone down. But still, they lost to a Cardinals team they should have presumptively beaten. And now they go on the road, I believe. I'm going to check that out real quick. On the road, I believe for now, to face a Bills team that's running away with the AFC East right now. So this feels like a game that, as they are on the road, that there's really no way to justify any sense of optimism in this Dolphins team in this one. Because last game, Tua, that was the game he got hurt, but he didn't look good before then. He was throwing picks. The Bills were happy to sit back in their zone coverage and, defend the spaces where Tyreek Hill makes his money. And so that's why I feel like I can't get too excited about the overs on Tyreek Hill bets. So that's why I'm taking the under in this one. 83.5 receiving yards at minus 137 as well. And then, in terms of the tight ends, this is a guy who's really coming into his own right now. And I think he's going to see his value in both fantasy and betting perspectives skyrocket for the rest of the season, and that is Trey McBride. For as long as the NFC West is as jumbled and jam-packed as it is right now, the Cardinals are a sneaky team to actually take this entire division, and Trey McBride could be the reason. Now, I feel like the best parts of the Cardinals' offense don't just involve Trey McBride. I do feel like the expansiveness of what Kyler as a dual-threat quarterback can bring and what Marvin Harrison now brings in the verticality of this offense really speaks to what this offense could look like. But Trey McBride is like kind of the safety blanket, the guy who holds everything together. The glue guy is the phrase I'm looking for. He can be the person who's the difference for this squad in this NFC West race. And in this game against the Bears, which is a very intriguing NFC matchup, look for him to challenge this young, rangy Bears secondary in ways that they haven't really seen before. So I'm taking the over here in 51.5 receiving yards at minus 137 to kind of hold down that tight end position because he's going to be doing it for the rest of the season. The final one, before we go to break, Jared Goff hitting the under here. It seems like a popular one right now because even though you feel weird because it's the Lions and it's Goff and he's been efficient all season long, it might not even matter in terms of, the Lions winning this game. It doesn't matter that Jared Goff hasn't, put up these gaudy numbers that people were expecting of him. And that's fine because the Lions have been winning. But it's just something to note in the betting market when, these over-unders come out. And this is a lofty total for him. 247.5 passing yards considering where he's sitting at in certain moments. I would definitely take the under here. Yes, it's a divisional matchup that you kind of expect them to win now, especially since Jordan Love is out, but it's still the toughest defense they faced. They're going to have to find ways to beat this team without, having to rely on Jared Goff. And they've done it before, so why not, continue to have this perspective hinge on the depth of the Lions and just go with the fact that the Lions are such a deep team that's not going to matter. So that's why I feel like Jared Goff, from here on out, you're going to have to monitor how lofty his numbers are in terms of prop bets because chances are he's always going to hit the under. But let me know what you think in the comments. I think all of these prop bets are versatile enough for you to get engaged no matter which team you want to bet on this weekend. But coming up right after this break, we take a little bit of a break from the NFL talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, college football, Week 10, giving you a betting preview on some of the biggest, most important games of the season, right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you that if you want to contribute and interact with the show more directly, make use of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to interact with the show, get your opinions on air, leave a tip or donation if you so choose. But most of all, it just makes the show that much better. And I truly and deeply appreciate all of you out there leaving your support for the show and others around the network as well. Without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of the day. And like I said, we're taking a little bit of a transition into the world of college football. Week 10, separating some contenders from some pretenders this weekend, perhaps. And Saturday's slate could not look any more fascinating. A lot of interesting games, potential trap games, if you will, for some teams. But 4 really stand out from a betting perspective. Because whether it be a road favorite going into a very hostile environment or a potential trap game in the ACC, I feel like a lot of these games hold weight now, especially since the first rankings are coming out pretty soon. I think after this week. So look for a lot of shakeups. Without further ado, here's a little bit of a betting perspective on some of the weekend's biggest games. Starting off perhaps the biggest game of the weekend, Ohio State, 4.5-point road favorites going into Happy Valley to take on the Nittany Lions of Penn State. And let me tell you, I was up there last weekend, and even though it was an away game, the atmosphere in Penn State was electrifying. There's an aura, as the kids say, about this team that makes you feel like they really are going to rise to the occasion this time. This is the game. One of the games that they've been wanting to win in the James Franklin era, but haven't necessarily gotten over the hump with. I believe they're 1-12 in games against Ohio State or Michigan. This is their time. They're at home at what should be a rocking Beaver Stadium to really make their mark in the CFP race. I don't know if this is going to be the win that elevates them to number 1. I would still say Oregon will be number 1 because they still have that win as well. But it's a win against an Ohio State team that looks like it's reeling right now. But there's a reason why Ohio State is a 4.5-point favorite, and it's probably because not just about the whole Drew Aller situation, and I do believe he will play in this game, but it's more about the completeness of this team, even despite the fact that if they lose this game, they should be out of the CFP race, all things considered. I still think when you look at it, they have enough depth, they have enough experience to go on the road and beat what is a passionate Penn State team. It really hasn't faced a defense or a team quite as physical as Ohio State. But there's going to be a way that Penn State can stay in this game. It's going to be if their defense can wreak havoc on this banged-up Ohio State offensive line, because that's where all the problems abound for Ohio State. Their offense can move the football still, because they still have Will Howard, who brings experience and somewhat level-headedness to this offense. They still have 2 of the best running backs in the country in Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. But that O-line, yes, they lost Tate Ratledge early in the season, but they haven't really figured things out. I believe they lost a backup, Josh Simmons, to injury as well for the rest of the season. So that's where Penn State can win a battle. The offense, on the other hand, is going to have to rely on potentially a very limited Drew Aller. And it's going to all be about how they want to pick and choose their spots to exploit Ohio State's weaknesses in their defense, where they have few. And I feel like the way they're going to do it is use the physicality of Tyler Warren in different play styles. They're going to use the physicality of their running backs with Singleton and Allen. And Drew Aller is going to have to play the most efficient game of his college career. But if they do all those things, play efficient on offense, and dominate the line of scrimmage on defense, they have a chance. But I still think right now Ohio State deserves to be the favorites on the road. So look for this to be an interesting game that could decide which of these teams has the upper hand in not just the Big Ten, but in the CFP race as well. But then the second game I want to get to is kind of a trap game, moving over to the ACC, where Clemson take on Louisville. They're 11.5-point favorites here and have been playing some of the best football in the country ever since their season opening loss to Georgia. But the reason why I feel like Louisville can be a trap game for this team is because of the fact that Clemson feels like they haven't really been in second gear just yet. All of these wins have been good wins, and Cade Klubnik has looked like one of the most impressive QBs in the country, so kudos to him. But Louisville has proven that they're a team that might not get over the hump in certain games like they did against a missed opportunity against Miami, but there certainly seems like they're a team that can push a ACC contender like Miami, like a Clemson, to the brink. They have physicality on defense. Tyler Schaff is playing efficient football. They have some weapons. And Ja'Cory Brooks, who is an Alabama transfer, they can score points in bunches. So look for this to be a closer game than people expect. I still think Clemson will win, but I don't think they'll cover the spread here. I think Louisville is too dangerous a team to ignore in this kind of ACC conversation of potentially playing spoiler. So this game is definitely going to be one that Clemson can't go through the motions through. And so that's why I'm kind of concerned and apprehensive about fully buying into this being another Clemson blowout. But that being said, if you know it's a closer game than usual, I wouldn't expect Clemson to fall out of the CFP conversation, because they have so many impressive wins coming back from that season opening loss, like I said, to Georgia. But this could be their toughest game on the schedule, and then if they win it, it should be smooth sailing to the ACC championship game. But it is a big if. But now, let's go to an SEC game that really isn't necessarily a CFP elimination game anymore, as this Ole Miss team isn't in my personal conversation concerning the CFP. They might be on my outside looking in list, but it still is an interesting SEC contest here. Ole Miss, 6-point favorites at Arkansas, which has proven to be a tough place to play. Don't underestimate the power of Arkansas. Talon Green, going to be one of the more underrated, more underrespected, I believe, QBs in the country. And this is a talented roster for Arkansas. This is a team that held its own and beat Tennessee. And not for nothing, I feel like Ole Miss is kind of in that Tennessee mold where they rely too much on certain things to go right for their football team. And so that's why I feel like this is another trap game. They have physicality on defense. I love Luke Haas and Andrew Armstrong, weapons on the offensive side for Green. And I feel like this Arkansas Razorbacks team, could be primed for an upset here and potentially in 2 weeks against my Texas Longhorns. They're that dangerous and that good. So look for this not to be a CFP eliminator, because I feel like Ole Miss is already dead and buried kind of in this conversation. They have 2 losses and they need some slip-ups along the way for other teams. But this still is going to be a challenging game for both teams, especially for Ole Miss, though, in this SEC picture. Now, here's what I want to say about the SEC race. Because you would think that teams on the periphery, like, say, Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee now, would find ways to beat teams like Arkansas and Vanderbilts of the world. But now it's really proven that the SEC is deeper than we think. And especially for this game being on the road and Ole Miss not living up to the expectations, I think that this is the game where the SEC truly gets turned on its head. And I know that's kind of a weird thing to say because there are so many SEC games still to come that could truly make things bonkers in the CFP race. But this feels like a game where the balance shift in the SEC tilts on its head a little bit, because Ole Miss was one of the most hyped teams in the SEC in the preseason. And now with 2 losses, potentially getting 3 losses against a team that not many people expected to play a huge role, whether it be as a spoiler, potentially a bowl game contender in Arkansas, that speaks a lot to how the season has gone for the SEC and how frustrating it can be for the trajectory of the rest of the season. But that's my 2 cents on the SEC. Let me know what you think in the comments. The final game is another big ACC encounter. This one truly is a CFP eliminator because one of these teams, could have the opportunity to go 11-1, and the other, is going to have to be on the outside looking in. But Pitt, SMU. SMU, 7.5-point favorites at home against the Pittsburgh Panthers. This game is a classic offenses versus defense game. And what I mean by that is Pitt certainly has the efficiency and ball retention skills on the offensive side to frustrate SMU and really dictate the pace of this game. But SMU has one of the most challenging offenses the Pittsburgh defense has faced. And this Pittsburgh defense, yes, has looked very good. They're a young unit mixed in with a lot of experienced guys as well. But I feel like SMU has so much versatility now that they brought in Kevin Jennings at the QB position. Rashard Smith's proven to be one of the most versatile running backs in the nation. And this is going to really be a challenge, a true litmus test for both of these units if they want to sustain their fight for a CFP spot and sustain their ACC hype. I feel like where this game is going to be won is whether or not, SMU can have sustained drives rather than rely on the big play. And on the defensive side of the football, for the Pitt defense to continue to be opportunistic. Because Kevin Jennings, as a dual threat guy, has that explosive ability, but he can have a propensity to turn the ball over. So look for that to be a huge aspect of this game. It should be an exciting one, and it should be a game that truly can break the ACC race wide open. But let me know what you think in the comments, because that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we talk about some important injuries to monitor in terms of Week 9 of the fantasy football season, along with the ensuing fantasy implications that might come into play for you. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And our third segment of the day here is going to be concerning some injury updates and ensuing fantasy implications for this week of the fantasy football season. Now, not many big ones to really be concerned about this week. A lot of kind of minor injuries, and not necessarily injuries that would really impact the depth of your fantasy football squad, but still some things to monitor. But also, we're going to be talking about a more positive aspect of injuries, if you can call it that. The return of certain players to certain squads that could really help you in your push for a fantasy playoff spot this season. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about the minor injuries that were sustained just this past week before we get into more overarching injuries and potential returns for certain players. Let's talk about Drake May first and foremost, because this one I'm not necessarily too worried about. Jerod Mayo said that he was practicing yesterday. He practiced yesterday in a limited role. He still is in concussion protocol, but that gives me optimism that he could potentially start this week against, I believe, let me just check their schedule, but he should be able to start in this game with the Titans. And, I feel like the reason why this one could be a little bit more impactful, should he not start compared to if he does, because of the production he's been getting out of very underrated, undervalued receivers in the fantasy market. Keishon Butte has been great with him. Demario Douglas has been good with him. Ramondre Stevenson in the backfield has looked a little bit more rejuvenated these past couple of weeks. So I feel like if this Drake May injury does extend for a couple of weeks, maybe because of the fact that, concussion protocol is very interesting to come back from, I still think that, this Patriots offense could be fine. And if Jacoby Brissett has to play this game, so be it. But once he comes back, he's still going to be effective, and all his guys are going to be productive again. So that's why I feel like this one is so interesting, because out of all these quarterbacks who are more concerning in terms of injuries, Drake May is one that you forget about because of the way he's elevated this Pats roster. Now let's get into a much more pressing kind of injury here. Maybe not as pressing as we once thought when it happened, but still one of note as the Packers go into one of their most challenging games this season. Jordan Love with a groin injury. Now, a lot of people were saying that he looked like he was ready to go back into play last week after he sustained it, but this one could be very cautionary. And not for nothing, Malik Willis is serviceable enough to run this offense, again, if he's asked to come into duty against the Lions. But then again, it is the Lions. So the concern is, do you start Malik Willis and risk it all in a game that you feel is one of your most important to date? Or do you try and bring back Jordan Love and have him risking getting more injured than he already is? But at the end of the day, the decision stems down to the effectiveness of both of them. If it's Jordan Love, then you know that he can effectively run this offense. He's looked like one of the best QBs in the NFL since his return from that earlier injury. But if it's Malik Willis, you're going to have to play it a little bit more safe. But both ways, ironically, could work for the Packers in this one. Because if you control the football, that keeps the offense off the field. And that could suggest that potentially the Packers will be fine with starting Malik Willis. But if you really want to turn this game into a shootout, that projects more towards Love. So it's really about how the game plans out for the Packers here. Because chances are you want to start Jordan Love in this game. And it looks like he can. But if you feel he's not going to be as effective in this one, then you might want to play it safe. Because who knows? Keeping the ball might be the difference in this game for the Packers. And so that's why this injury is so weird. But also it's weird because of the fact that it eliminates some of the production you can get from guys like Kraft, guys like Reed in this offense should it be Malik Willis who starts. So that's why I feel like this one's a really interesting fantasy conundrum to try and figure out here. Because we're going to get the news sooner or later about whether or not he will start. And if he doesn't, then that could be an interesting concern to try and figure out if you're a fantasy football manager who owns Packers receivers or running backs. Let's get into one of the more unusual injuries of these past couple of weeks with the whole DK Metcalf situation. Now, this injury seems very vague, and as I said before, I feel like I'm someone who follows teams or is a fan of teams who don't really know how to present injury information well. They're very tight-lipped about certain things that happen in the organization, especially with the injuries, and this one feels the same way for Seattle and DK Metcalf because we know it's an MCL sprain, but we don't necessarily know the timeline, and it's week to week. McDonald said he was optimistic that potentially he could play this weekend, but this does come at an interesting time for Seattle because they're playing a very important divisional game this weekend against the Rams, but then they're on a bye. And then you get into the more challenging part of their schedule. So it's going to be interesting to see if McDonald holds DK out, risks potentially losing this game, but gets him back after the bye, gets a couple more players back after the bye, and we see a new and improved Seattle. Or you start DK Metcalf, try and win this game, try and take the lead in this jumbled NFC West, and then rest him up for the bye so that he can be even better for the stretch run. So that one's interesting just because we know so little about the severity of this injury and whether or not it could be re-aggravated should he play this weekend. But it's still one to monitor because of the fact he's been very productive this season from a fantasy perspective. So that's why I feel like that one's also very pressing in terms of what Seattle might need and how they might use him in these coming weeks. And then let's get into the injury that just broke and could be very prescient in tonight's game. Stefon Diggs. Now, I feel like, once Nico Collins comes back, this receiver core will be just fine. Because it was just fine without Stefon Diggs last year when it was Collins, Brown, and Dell. But in this game, it's certainly going to be missing. I feel like a receiver combination of Tank Dell, Robert Woods, and Xavier Hutchinson isn't going to create much separation for C.J. Stroud. And if you remember, last year, in this very game, C.J. Stroud looked the most mortal he'd looked to that point in his rookie season. So this is going to be a very challenging game for the Texans. So if you have a guy like Tank Dell in your roster, who potentially took a flyer on one of their tier 2 receivers or wide receiver 2s, then good luck to you tonight, because it's going to be a very uphill climb for this receiver core. But it gives them an opportunity to grow. Guys like Woods, who we always know can be reliable wherever he's playing as one of those third down options in situational moments. And Xavier Hutchinson, first real time we see him as a rookie out of Iowa State. But he could be somewhat exciting. I've seen him before watching the Big 12, and he looks like a very exciting project for them. So this could be an interesting situation where, yes, you're kind of ruining the injury to Stefon Diggs if you own him, but also the unique opportunity to open up new avenues for your receiving core as well. So that's why, this injury to me feels more like an opportunity unlocked for the depth of this Texans receiver room to make it even more versatile than it is kind of a woe is me moment. Because a lot of the time in fantasy, you can never predict season-ending injuries, especially this late in the season. But you have to take them with a grain of salt, and you have to accept them eventually, because if you don't, then you're not looking at the glass half full here. You're trying to account for too many things, and you get caught up in an injury when you could be surveying your other options here. The Texans now have a lot of options, especially now that Nico Collins could come back, and that will help this Texans receiver room. But for the time being, just work with what you have. And so that's why this injury to me isn't as detrimental from a fantasy perspective as it is in real life. So that's why I'm a little bit optimistic about the outlook of what guys like Woods and Hutchinson can bring, because we know that Texans wide receivers will always get unique opportunities to succeed. Now let's talk about the positive aspects of these injury updates here. The guys who could return. Let's start with Christian McCaffrey, obviously, because a lot of fantasy owners are still PO'd that he did not start the season out for them if they picked him number 1 overall. I feel like the plan for them is that he will sit out. Actually, they're on the bye week, so he won't have to sit out as a earning game. But when the bye week is over, he will come back for their Week 10 game against the Buccaneers. That, is an opportunity to actually see what he can mean down the stretch for the 49ers. Because my thing is that the 49ers without him have been mostly okay, but he does add a different dimension that you have to account for when he's in there and healthy for the Niners that they don't really have. I think the main problem for them has been in the red zone. The efficiency there has plummeted without him, and neither of the running backs can figure out how to score in that area. They're very good in open space, both Mason and Garendo, but I don't necessarily know if they can be as physical, as explosive, as dynamic in the red zone as Christian McCaffrey is. And that's not, to their fault, but it is something to monitor once he comes back, because of the fact he's so important to what they do and can actually open up a lot more than just the run game for this 49ers squad. So we're going to have to see once he comes back. If he does next 2 weeks' time against the Bucks, then we'll have to see. And then let's talk about TJ Hawkinson, who could make a return as soon as Sunday night against the Colts. We'll talk about that game in the last segment. But that should be a very exciting news for Minnesota Vikings fans, especially for Sam Darnold as well, because he hasn't really had an option over the middle. He's really tried to work the perimeter too often, try to get the ball to his perimeter threats in Jefferson and Addison. But now that he has a big tight end who is physical at the catch point, can challenge backers, I feel like that just diversifies this Vikings offense a lot more. It just makes it that much more potent. Yes, it could lead to the detriment of, Jefferson, Addison, Jones owners even, but you have to understand how important guys are from an offensive perspective. TJ Hawkinson changed the game for the Vikings, I feel like. And so you can't necessarily count him out when you have to consider the depth of this Vikings team from a fantasy perspective. But let me know what you think in the comments, because I feel like injuries, they'll come and go, and you can either be on top of them or try and play them out. But this segment is just to keep updated with them throughout the week. But coming up next, I make my picks of the week for the biggest games of Week 9 in the NFL. We'll be right back after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, I do kind of want to get into my picks of the week, one of my favorite segments on the show here. Let me know what you think about my picks here. With the 4 games I picked, diverse as possible, division games, or just, an exciting NFC contest that I think can be a surprise this weekend to some people. So without further ado, let's jump right into my Chris's picks of the week. Starting off with the Cowboys and the Falcons. Falcons 3-point favorites at home, over under 51.5. Dallas plus 120 to win, Atlanta minus 140. Now this game is just a truly bizarre one, because these are two teams where you feel like they have very similar approaches or very similar outlooks to how their season has gone. For the Cowboys, I've already said enough about this team throughout my career here as a GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. They just feel like an offense that's wasting opportunities for different players to mature within it. They were too reliant on Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb being the superstars, and now that they have the contracts to prove it, there's too much pressure and tension surrounding those two to really overcome the struggles we've seen on the football field. And a lot of people are saying, well, yeah, they might need to add a running back, maybe that will help the defensive tackle. No. I believe these issues can be fixed in-house, because I love what I've seen in brief spurts out of guys like Jalen Tolbert, guys like Jake Ferguson. And those running backs are more situational, yes, than you would like them to be, but they still can have an impact. Zeke can still be one of those physical ground pound guys, and Dowdle can be used in the pass game a little more, because I feel that's like where he's a little bit more comfortable. But that's the reason why I'm frustrated with the Cowboys so often. It's because they have a lot of weapons they can utilize. They're just not doing it to great effect. With the Falcons, I feel like they're an enigma right now on both sides of the football, where you kind of know what you're going to get with the defense in terms of they have a pretty stout run defense, but their pass defense is very porous. Then the offensive side of the football, I feel like they have more upside right now than the Cowboys, and that's why I will take them in this game. But I still feel like there are moments where it becomes a little bit frustrating and stagnant. Like, you can't always rely on Kirk Cousins to bail you out through his pocket presence, because at some point, defenses like we saw with Seattle are going to generate enough pressure to get to him. And so it's going to be up to Raheem Morris and his offensive coordinator, Zach Robinson, to figure out a way to better protect Kirk Cousins, but be efficient, because we've seen that Kirk Cousins against bad defenses that don't necessarily pressure him is a serviceable quarterback. But there are going to be games where people are going to generate pressure. Maybe not this game, but they're going to be games where defenses can get consistent pressure on him. And so they're going to have to cover up that flaw in their offense if they want to continue with this play style and this offensive philosophy. I am taking them, though, in this game, like I said, -3. But I feel like in the future, they're going to have to be wary of what I say. If you can't necessarily account for the pressure teams can bring, then this season can go off the rails very quickly for Atlanta. But they do have the upper hand in the NFC South, and they do hold a tiebreaker. So who knows how the season will look for the Falcons, but I'm taking them in this one. Now we get into the divisional games. Lions, Packers. This one, I feel like, is one in which, I could go either way here, just because the Packers feel like a team that can truly challenge the Lions, especially with their secondary, how active they've been in terms of generating takeaways. But there's something to be said about the Lions' versatility and how they play the game of football. How fluid they look in offense, defense, special teams, what have you. And how they can find different ways to break out a team. They've shown that they can run the football, beat you into submission with the running game. They've shown that they can add trick plays into their offensive mold. Jared Goff doesn't have to throw the football as much. And so that just really makes this Lions offense so confusing to figure out. And the defense, yes, that Hutchinson loss is going to be very big. They might want to look for pass rushes before the deadline, but it's still one that is very opportunistic, still very savvy, still very intelligent, and I really like this young secondary, especially Brian Branch, and how important he's going to be down the stretch. On the Packers side of things, they are a team that, like I said, on the defensive side of the football might be the most frustrating test the Lions have had to date. On the offensive side of the football, though, they're going to have to figure out what philosophy they want to go with. If there's questions about Jordan Love's status, if you feel like you need him to play in this game to have a chance to win, what risk does that come with in terms of re-aggravating that groin injury? But if you play with Malik Willis, how can you play efficient enough to put points on the board, but still retain the ball so that the Lions' offense stays on the sidelines? And so that's why I feel like I could have picked the Packers here as dogs, but I have to take the Lions just because there's just so many more ways they can win this game. And if there are still questions come, say, Saturday or early Sunday morning about the status of Jordan Love, that give me pause for how this game goes. So I have to pick the Lions here just for safety's sake. They're a safe bet. They look like one of, if not the best teams in the NFL. Now let's get into a game that I'm kind of disappointed to talk about. The Rams-Seahawks. Now, this isn't necessarily a must-win game for either of these teams because of the fact the NFC West is so kind of congested right now. But I will say that the Rams have the better outlook right now. They bring back Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, hand the Vikings their second loss this season at home, and they look like a completely new team. Whereas the Seahawks, they have DK Metcalf potentially out for this one. They have a terrible offensive line who's not going to get either one of Abraham or Lucas or George Fant back anytime soon, and the defense still has too many questions that they need to solve. So even at home, even favored surprisingly in this game, I have to pick the Rams as the dog. My first ever, I believe, dog pick in a Chris's pick segment. So it's against my favorite team. Go figure. So I feel like, though, I have to pick the Rams in this one because of the fact that they just have the better team, the more complete team right now. And McVay feels like he's going to be in his bag for the rest of the season, getting good looks for both Kupp and Nakua and really making this offense click. And not for nothing, you also have to worry about Kyron Williams. This guy's been in a heater. How wrong was I about him to start this season? I thought he was a guy who had too small a sample size to succeed from a fantasy perspective in real life, and look where he is right now. He's completely proven me wrong, and this Rams team is going to continue to make waves. Look for them to quickly make a rise in the NFC West and especially in people's power rankings and potentially the Super Bowl contention ladder. So that's why I'm picking the Rams here. Painful that my first ever dog pick, like I said, is my favorite team, but it has to be done. The final pick that I want to make is another divisional game. 3 divisional games. Go figure. In my Chris's pick segment this week. Dolphins, Bills. Now, this game, I could go off the rails here and say, I love the Dolphins in this one. Tua's back. He's healthy. This offense is going to get clicking again. But this movie has already happened before, and we saw what happened in it. We saw that even before the injury that he sustained, Tua did not look good in this one. He struggled mightily. Threw 3 picks, could not handle the different coverages that the Bills were throwing at him, and the Bills were content to let this game play out the way it did. And so, look for the Bills to stick with that script because they know who they are, and they know that in games such as this, where they can beat teams in a submission, they have game plans that they can rotate with week in, week out. Now, we're going to have to see it against better teams than the Dolphins, but for now, the Bills are proving that they're one of the most versatile teams, one of the most adaptable teams in the NFL right now. And that should scare a lot of people. That's why I'm picking the Bills, because this division is already wrapped up as far as I'm concerned. But if the Bills win convincingly late again, that goes to show that they can take care of business against inferior opponents and they can get ready to play superior opponents down the stretch. So look for this to be one of those games where the mettle of the Bills truly gets proven this week. Let me know what you think in the comments. Coming up for our final segment, we look ahead to the Sunday night football game between the Indianapolis Colts starting Joe Flacco after a weird situation with Anthony Richardson against the Minnesota Vikings, coming off their second loss of the season. As my man Andre enters the chat, we'll be right back to talk about that right after this short break. Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day here on the show. And as always, I like to jump the gun here on this show. I like talking about Sunday Night Football a little bit early. And so I'm going to be talking about this bizarre matchup between the Indianapolis Colts and Minnesota Vikings here. And it was made bizarre a little bit more on the Colts side of things when it was announced that Anthony Richardson will be benched in favor of Joe Flacco for this one. I don't necessarily know how to feel about this move. It's very interesting, but if the Colts feel like Joe Flacco is the best option for the rest of the season, then so be it. And I've heard that there were rumors there was tension in the Colts locker room that could have led to this decision, so maybe that's why they wanted to allay that and potentially have Joe Flacco come in and try to settle things down. But it's truly an interesting situation there in Indianapolis, one that really makes me not dislike this team, but makes me a little skeptical about what it's going to do going forward. Because if Richardson's future is getting called into question, then is he really the answer there? And does he have a future in the NFL even, if he's already causing a little bit of issue within the Colts organization? Then you have the Vikings on the other side of things, who are coming off their second loss of the season after a 5-0 start. And it was a very emotional loss. I feel like this was one coming after a very emotional game against the Lions, where you lose on a last-second field goal, basically. You travel halfway across the country to a Rams team that you weren't expecting to bring back both their weapons, maybe just one, but not both. And you get the Sean McVay treatment, so to speak. And I feel like this game should be an easy Minnesota win, just because what I'm hearing from the Colts is not great. But I feel like this is another game where Minnesota could be tested. And I feel like in the grand scheme of things, if the Vikings don't win this game, then who's to say this Vikings team might find itself falling into an abyss? I feel like that's the big thing that I could take away from this game, that as much as I want to feel like this is a bounce back for the Vikings, there's a seed of doubt that, this could be another one of those games where a 39-year-old Joe Flacco, much like he did with the Browns last year, leads the Colts into the promised land yet again. And it's kind of a little bit, not necessarily deja vu, I don't know a good phrase for this, but it's kind of a little bit weird to picture a world where this could be the turning point for both of these teams' seasons. If the Vikings lose, it allays fears that this team would completely go off the tracks. But if the Colts win, I feel like a lot of people will be saying, surely Joe Flacco can't do this again. And the funny thing about this game especially for the Colts, and I might have to look at the Colts' schedule to really assess how a trip to the postseason could be plausible. This is one of those games where Joe Flacco starting gives me a little bit more pause than I would initially think. And that's because this Vikings defense is still one that is primed to play well against quarterbacks like Flacco. And potentially, Anthony Richardson's mobility could have helped in this scenario. But I feel like if, the Colts trust in Joe Flacco more right now than Anthony Richardson, that's a huge morale boost. We saw it last week with Jameis Winston with the Browns. Maybe, it's not as deep as that, but if there is some sort of tension surrounding Anthony Richardson and his role with the Colts, then Joe Flacco might be someone who can boost the morale. I think he's still less than ideal for this matchup, which is why I'm a little bit apprehensive saying that the Colts could potentially cover this spread, even though it's a big one, and Minnesota minus 6.5, and the over-under is 45.5. I still think it's an interesting matchup to see if this is a legitimate opportunity for the Colts to make the playoffs with him. Because if the Colts do make the playoffs, then the question is asked, well, what to make of Joe Flacco? Can he stay on the roster? Can he be a bridge quarterback potentially? Have Anthony Richardson kind of fall to the wayside as a failed project this early in his career? There are so many questions that could stem from the ramifications of a Colts win or a Vikings win this season, in this game particularly, so to speak, that I kind of feel like it would be fun just to see a Colts win. But that being said, I have to pick the Vikings because, they're still the better team. This defense, like I said, there's no way I feel like the over isn't going to hit in terms of, say, quarterback sacks and hurries, because Joe Flacco's is basically a statue back there. But that being said, I'm still giving the Colts a chance in this one, because if it's a spirit thing, a more like uplifting kind of thing to boost the Colts, rather than a true change, then I don't really know how to feel about it. But if it's a legitimate recognition of an opportunity, then you have to run with it. So this feels like one of those moments where I'm caught between two mindsets. One that thinks the Colts can succeed and one that knows they probably won't. And so this game is really going to be a rough one for bettors. And I'm not saying that you should bet the Colts, but there is something to be said about a culture change, a quarterback change that could help a team. And you're getting the Vikings at a very weird time in their season where their guards might be down right now. But that being said, I will mention, to close the show, the reason as well why Minnesota should be a comfortable winner in this one. That is the return of TJ Hawkinson. Let me not forget about that. I feel like, the reason why the Vikings offense looks so stagnant in these past two games, because, Sam Darnold was getting pressured a little too much and he didn't necessarily have easy routes to throw to or easy looks. So TJ Hawkinson, against defenses that could project to bring more pressure, could be the safety blanket that they need. He could open up a lot more in the screen game. He could open up a lot more down the sideline. I feel like there's a little bit more versatility now to the Vikings that wasn't there before in those two losses that defenses were able to exploit. So I feel like, with him coming back, with the Colts defense being what it is, which is not great, then of course I feel like the Vikings are comfortable winners in this one. That's why, I feel like I can't talk too highly about the Colts, even though I want to. But it's just the way this game is set up and the way these two teams look coming into it. The tension of the Colts, the kind of letdown of the Vikings. And so that's why I can't necessarily completely lean Vikings, but I kind of feel like it's the safest bet because there's too much question surrounding what the Colts could be. They could be a great thing, much like the Browns were last year with Joe Flacco at the helm. Or they could completely fall apart due to the tension surrounding this decision. But this is a landmark decision in the Colts 2024 season. Because if it works, then it's a gem. But if it doesn't, then it could be a detriment to the future of this franchise. And that's what's most important. But this is a very winnable game for both teams. It's just about the Vikings being a little bit better. And the return of TJ Hawkinson as well. That diversifies this offense a little bit after those two losses. That makes me feel like the Vikings are winning. That being said, I'm taking the Vikings. It's a little bit weird, but I feel like it's the safest way to go. Now, just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you want more content such as this Also, subscribe to our Instagram and TikTok channels if you so choose as well. Make yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Triggers features here on the show. If you want to interact more directly with our live streams across the network, great way to support the network. It's truly appreciated by all concerned. But that being said, we'll be back for a final show of the week tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern as always. Happy, safe Halloween to you all. I'm out for today.